There is exactly one person a narcissist genuinely fears, and it isn't who most people assume. It isn't a rival for status, isn't someone louder or more aggressive than they are, isn't even someone who confronts them directly, because confrontation, as strange as this sounds, is often something a narcissist knows exactly how to manage. The person a narcissist actually fears is far quieter than that, far more unassuming, someone who spent years absorbing, softening, explaining, forgiving, and then, at some point, simply stopped, gathered herself, and walked away without asking permission, without needing an apology, without leaving a door cracked open for the eventual return they'd always been able to count on before. Today I want to talk about this specific person, the one psychology sometimes calls the super empath, why she represents such a unique and destabilizing threat to a narcissist's entire psychological structure, and why her walking away triggers something far deeper and more disorienting than ordinary loss. To understand why this particular kind of departure is so uniquely threatening, you first have to understand what a super empath actually is, because it's a distinct profile, not simply someone who is very empathetic. A super empath is someone who combines extraordinarily deep emotional attunement with an unusually resilient sense of self, someone who can feel enormous compassion for a narcissist's underlying wounds without losing herself entirely in the process of extending that compassion. This combination is rare, and it's precisely this rarity that makes her both so valuable to a narcissist while she's present, and so uniquely dangerous once she leaves. Most people who stay in relationships with narcissists for extended periods do so because their sense of self has become entangled with the relationship. They've lost the clear boundary between their own identity and their role within the dynamic. A super empath is different. She can be deeply embedded in the relationship, deeply attuned to the narcissist's emotional world, and still maintain an internal core that never fully dissolves into it. And this internal core is exactly what allows her eventually to do something most partners in these dynamics never manage: leave completely, cleanly, without the usual half departures, without the repeated returns that narcissists have learned to count on as part of the predictable rhythm of the relationship. The first reason narcissists fear this specific departure is because it destroys their operating assumption about how relationships end. Narcissists, over years of relational patterns, develop a kind of internal model for what abandonment looks like, and that model almost always includes a return. Partners leave in anger and come back once the anger cools. Partners threaten to leave and get talked out of it through charm, promises, or manufactured crisis. Partners pull away and get pulled back in through intermittent reinforcement, small gestures of vulnerability that reignite hope. This model works again and again because most partners haven't developed the internal resilience to sustain a clean break. The pull of hope, of history, of investment tends to be stronger than their resolve to stay away. The super empath breaks this model entirely because her departure doesn't follow the expected rhythm. She doesn't leave in a reactive spike of anger that predictably cools. She leaves after a long, deliberate process of recognizing the pattern clearly, which means by the time she actually walks away, the decision has already been fully metabolized, already integrated, already stable in a way that the narcissist's usual tactics simply cannot destabilize. And a narcissist encountering a departure that doesn't respond to any of their usual tools experiences something close to genuine confusion, because their entire relational strategy has never had to account for someone who leaves and simply doesn't come back. The second reason involves what her departure actually reveals about the narcissist, both to himself and, more importantly, to anyone watching from outside. As long as the super empath stays, even while struggling, even while absorbing more than she should, her presence functions as a kind of ongoing evidence that the relationship, however difficult, must still be fundamentally workable. Otherwise, why would someone this perceptive, this emotionally intelligent, this capable of seeing through manipulation, continue choosing to stay? Her presence, in other words, becomes part of the narcissist's protective narrative, a kind of implicit endorsement that keeps outside observers, and sometimes even the narcissist himself, from fully confronting the severity of the pattern. The moment she leaves, cleanly, permanently, without the ambiguity of a temporary separation, that protective narrative collapses. Her departure becomes, whether she intends it this way or not, a kind of testimony, one that's very difficult for a narcissist to explain away convincingly, precisely because everyone who knew her also knew how much patience, how much understanding, how much genuine effort she brought to the relationship before she finally reached her limit. If someone with her level of emotional capacity couldn't make it work, the explanation that she was simply too sensitive or she never understood him becomes much harder to sustain credibly, even to himself. The third reason is more internal, more psychologically destabilizing, and it has to do with what the super empath specifically represented to the narcissist's fragile, carefully protected sense of self. We've talked in previous conversations about how narcissists often rely on their partner as an external regulatory system, someone who manages the emotional labor they've never developed the internal capacity to manage themselves. With most partners, this reliance, while significant, doesn't create quite the same depth of dependency that develops with a super empath specifically, because her emotional attunement operates at a level most partners simply can't match. She doesn't just manage surface-level conflict, she often understands the narcissist's underlying insecurities more clearly than he understands them himself, offering a level of validation and understanding that feels to him uniquely irreplaceable. This creates a much deeper dependency than the narcissist typically experiences with other partners, and it's precisely this depth of dependency that makes her departure so uniquely destabilizing. He isn't just losing a partner, he's losing the one person who understood him at a level he's rarely, if ever, experienced before or since. And some part of him knows, even if he'll never admit it out loud, that finding this same depth of understanding again is far less likely than his usual pattern of quick replacement would suggest. The fourth reason relates directly to something we discussed in an earlier conversation, the way narcissists frantically search for replacement supply after a partner leaves, and why this search, when it follows a super empath's departure specifically, tends to feel less successful, less satisfying, more haunted by comparison than it does after other relationships end. New partners simply don't offer the same combination of deep attunement and internal resilience that made the super empath so valuable in the first place. Some new partners might offer attunement without resilience, becoming easily destabilized, easily controlled, but lacking the depth of genuine understanding the super empath provided. Others might offer more resilience, more independence, but lack the same willingness to invest deeply in managing the narcissist's emotional world. The specific combination the super empath embodied, profound empathy paired with an intact, unshakable sense of self, is precisely what made her so effective in the relationship, and precisely what makes her so difficult to replace. Because most people who possess one of these qualities in abundance haven't necessarily developed the other alongside it. The fifth reason is perhaps the most uncomfortable one to name, honestly, and it's this: the super empath's departure often forces a narcissist into brief, unguarded moments of genuine self-reflection, moments he would never voluntarily choose to enter, but can't fully avoid in the disorienting aftermath of losing someone whose absence his usual defenses aren't equipped to explain away easily. This isn't the same as genuine growth, and I want to be careful not to overstate what this self-reflection typically produces. For most narcissists, these moments remain fragmentary, quickly suppressed, rarely developing into the kind of sustained accountability that would actually constitute change. But even brief, unwanted self-reflection represents a kind of exposure a narcissist's defense structure is specifically organized to avoid, and the super empath's clean, permanent departure creates exactly the kind of unresolved absence that keeps forcing these unwanted moments back to the surface again and again in ways a more ambiguous, reversible departure never quite manages to do. I want to pause here and say something important about why all 5 of these reasons matter, taken together, because I think it's easy to hear this and walk away with an oversimplified, almost triumphant narrative. The idea that the super empath's departure teaches the narcissist a lasting lesson, that her walking away finally forces the accountability and change he'd always avoided. I want to be honest with you about why that narrative, however satisfying it might feel, usually isn't accurate. The fear a narcissist experiences in response to this specific kind of departure is real, and the disruption to his usual patterns is real, but fear and disruption are not the same thing as transformation. Most narcissists, even after experiencing every single one of these 5 reactions in full force, do not emerge from this experience fundamentally changed. What typically happens instead is that the discomfort gets managed, eventually, through the same defense mechanisms that have always protected him from genuine accountability. Narrative reconstruction, where she becomes recast as unreasonable or unstable rather than as someone who simply reached a legitimate limit. Eventual replacement, however imperfect, that quiets the immediate discomfort, even if it never fully replicates what was lost. And a slow, gradual return to baseline functioning that allows the fear and disruption to fade without ever requiring the kind of internal reckoning that would actually constitute lasting change. What typically happens instead is that the discomfort gets managed, eventually, through the same defense mechanisms that have always protected him from genuine accountability. Narrative reconstruction, where she becomes recast as unreasonable or unstable rather than as someone who simply reached a legitimate limit. Eventual replacement, however imperfect, that quiets the immediate discomfort, even if it never fully replicates what was lost. And a slow, gradual return to baseline functioning that allows the fear and disruption to fade without ever requiring the kind of internal reckoning that would actually constitute lasting change. But I want to take this conversation somewhere more important now, because understanding what happens to him is only half the story, and honestly, it's the less consequential half. What actually matters, what actually deserves the deeper examination, is what happens to her, the super empath herself, in the aftermath of a departure this significant, and why understanding her transformation reveals something far more valuable than anything we could learn by continuing to focus on him. The first thing worth understanding about the super empath's experience after leaving is that her walking away was never actually about him, not in the way it might appear from the outside, and not in the way his own narrative reconstruction will eventually insist it was. The decision to leave, when it finally arrives fully formed, isn't primarily an act of punishment or a statement about his character. It's the culmination of a much longer, more internal process, the process of her finally, fully believing that her own well-being mattered enough to act on, that her own perception of the pattern was trustworthy enough to trust without needing his agreement first. This distinction matters enormously because it explains why her departure carries the specific weight and permanence it does. She isn't leaving to teach him a lesson, isn't leaving as a manipulative tactic to draw him back in through absence, isn't leaving with any expectation of him changing to earn her return. She's leaving because she finally, fully arrived at a conclusion about her own worth that no longer requires his validation to hold steady, and departures built on that kind of internal conviction simply don't operate according to the reversible, negotiable rhythm his usual tactics are designed to exploit. The second thing to understand is what happens inside her, specifically in the months following this kind of departure, because it looks genuinely different from what we discussed happening inside him. Where his experience tends to follow a predictable arc toward managed avoidance, denial, performance, replacement, narrative reconstruction, her experience, precisely because she possesses that intact internal resilience we discussed earlier, tends to follow a very different arc, one oriented toward integration rather than avoidance. This doesn't mean her process is painless. She'll likely move through real grief, real disorientation, real moments of doubt where old patterns whisper that she was too harsh, too quick to leave, too unwilling to keep trying. But unlike him, she has the internal architecture necessary to actually sit inside these difficult feelings without needing to immediately manage them away through performance or distraction. And this capacity for genuine sitting with, rather than avoiding, is precisely what allows her grief to eventually resolve into something more stable, more integrated, rather than remaining permanently unprocessed underneath a carefully maintained surface. The third thing worth exploring is how this experience specifically transforms her relationship with her own empathy going forward, because this is where the real, lasting significance of her departure lives, far more than in anything that happens to the narcissist she left behind. Before this relationship, and for much of its duration, her empathy likely operated largely as reflex by an automatic, largely unconscious extension of understanding and accommodation to anyone who needed it, offered without much discernment about whether the recipient was actually capable of receiving it responsibly. The experience of finally reaching her limit, of finally walking away cleanly, teaches her something her empathy alone never could, that empathy without discernment isn't actually a complete gift, it's a partial one. missing the crucial component that would make it sustainable rather than eventually depleting. This is the beginning of what I think of as empathy maturing into wisdom. Not becoming smaller, not becoming more guarded or cynical, but becoming more selective, more deliberate, more attuned not just to other people's pain, but to whether that pain is being offered in a context where her response can actually make a positive difference, rather than simply being absorbed indefinitely without meaningful change. The fourth thing, and this one deserves real emphasis, is how this experience changes her relationship with her own certainty, her own perception, her own right to trust what she's observing without requiring external confirmation first. For as long as she was in that relationship, some part of her likely spent considerable energy doubting her own read of the situation, wondering if she was being too sensitive, too harsh in her interpretation, too quick to label as manipulation what might simply be misunderstanding. The process of finally, fully trusting her own perception enough to leave, completely without ambiguity, without needing him to first acknowledge his behavior in order to validate her decision, represents a genuinely significant psychological achievement, one that extends far beyond this specific relationship. Once you've learned to trust your own perception enough to act decisively on it, even when the person you're leaving is actively working to convince you that your perception is wrong, that skill becomes portable. It shows up in future relationships as an early warning system that activates much faster than it used to. It shows up in professional settings as a clearer, quicker read on when something isn't right, even when everyone else in the room seems comfortable proceeding as if it is. This transformation, quiet and internal as it is, represents something far more valuable and far more permanent than anything that happens inside the narcissist she left behind. The fifth thing worth understanding, and I think this is genuinely important for anyone listening who recognizes themselves in this story, is that becoming a super empath, someone with both deep attunement and intact internal resilience, isn't a fixed trait you either have or don't have from birth. It's frequently forged specifically through experiences like the one we've been describing, through the difficult, extended process of learning to hold both compassion and boundaries simultaneously, something most people never have the specific catalyst to develop, because they never encounter a relationship extreme enough to force the lesson. This means that if you're currently in the earlier, more painful stages of this process, still absorbing more than you should, still explaining away behavior a part of you already recognizes clearly, still searching for the version of events that lets you stay a little longer, you are not failing at some test the super empath passed and you haven't. You are simply earlier in a process that, if you let it complete itself fully, tends to produce exactly the kind of resilient, discerning empathy we've spent this entire conversation describing, the kind a narcissist genuinely fears, not because it's harsh or unfeeling, but because it's finally fully immune to the specific tactics that used to work. I want to close this conversation the way we've closed the others, with a picture, because I think there's real value in actually seeing this transformation, rather than just hearing it described in the abstract. Picture her now, months or years past the departure we've spent this entire conversation examining, standing somewhere in her life that looks, on the surface, unremarkable. An ordinary morning, an ordinary conversation with a friend, an ordinary moment of noticing someone else's pain and offering exactly the right amount of understanding, no more, no less, calibrated now by a wisdom that simply wasn't available to her before this experience forged it. She still feels deeply. That was never going to change, and it was never supposed to. But underneath that depth now sits something new, something that wasn't fully there before, a quiet, unshakable knowledge that her own well-being belongs inside her own circle of care, not perpetually outside it, waiting to be addressed only after everyone else's needs have been fully met first. And picture him too, one final time, in whatever version of his life continues without her. Successful by external measures, perhaps. Occupied, seemingly moved on, but carrying somewhere underneath all of it, an absence he'll never fully name, a specific quality of understanding he experienced once and has never quite managed to locate again, no matter how many people move through his life afterward, no matter how convincingly he's rebuilt the narrative that explains why it never really mattered in the first place. Because that, in the end, is the real, quiet, cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. The narcissist doesn't fear the super empath because she's cruel or vindictive or determined to make him suffer. He fears her because she represents something his entire psychological structure has never learned: how to survive intact contact with someone who can see him completely, understand him more deeply than almost anyone ever has, and still, calmly, permanently, choose herself. That combination, full understanding paired with full self-respect, is the one thing his usual tools were never built to overcome. And once she walks away carrying both of those things fully intact, she doesn't just leave the relationship behind. She becomes permanently, in his memory, proof of the one kind of love he was offered and, through no fault but his own defended, unexamined history, was never quite capable of receiving.